The air inside the storage unit was thick with the scent of 2 decades of silence, a heavy mixture of dust, aging rubber, and forgotten time. 17-year-old Dylan Hayes sat in the cracked vinyl driver's seat of a 1967 Chevrolet Impala, a monument of metallic blue steel entombed in grime. He wasn't looking at the dulled chrome or the classic lines of the machine he had only dreamed of. His gaze was fixed on the elegant cursive script covering the yellowed page in his trembling hands. A weathered cardboard box lay open on the passenger seat, its simple, hand-written label, "For Dylan, when you are ready," now seeming like the most important words he had ever read. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on his cheek, then another, until a quiet, ragged sob escaped his chest, the first true expression of a grief and a love he never knew he was allowed to feel. In that moment, the sterile administrative narrative of his life dissolved, replaced by the ghost of a man he had never met, and the undeniable proof that he had never ever been forgotten. This is a story about how a single discovery can rewrite a past you thought you knew, and how the echoes of love can find you even after years of silence. If you believe that some connections can't be broken by time or distance, show your support by giving this story a like and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss its conclusion. We find it incredibly inspiring to see where our stories reach, so please feel free to let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your engagement helps these narratives find the people who need to hear them the most, and we are grateful to have you with us on this journey. Every part of this story is worth hearing, and it is a privilege to share it with you, knowing that the power of human connection is a universal language that resonates with us all, no matter where we are in the world. But to understand why this forgotten muscle car, sitting dormant for 20 years in a dark Oregon storage unit, held the power to completely shatter and rebuild a foster kid's entire reality, it is necessary to go back 3 weeks. We must return to a dreary Tuesday afternoon in Portland, to the 11th foster home Dylan had known, and to the arrival of a single registered letter from an unknown lawyer. That was the day a key was placed in a lock Dylan didn't even know existed, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead him to this dusty driver's seat. It was a journey that didn't begin with a destination in mind, but with the fragile, terrifying hope that he might finally belong to someone, somewhere, and that his life was more than just a number in a file. 17-year-old Dylan Hayes existed in a state of quiet, perpetual waiting. For the past 14 years, ever since he was a toddler of 3, his life had been a series of temporary addresses and provisional guardians, all managed by the Oregon Department of Human Services. He was a file in a cabinet, a name on a list, a collection of assessments and reports that chronicled a childhood spent in motion. Now, in his 11th foster home, he had mastered the art of being invisible. He moved through the world with a practiced stillness, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes often fixed on the ground. He had learned that expectations were the architects of disappointment, and so he built his inner world without them, creating a Spartan, functional space designed only to endure until the clock ran out on his time as a ward of the state. His entire existence was a long drawn-out breath, held in anticipation of an independence that felt both like a release and a terrifying void. His current placement was with Carlos Martinez, a man whose kindness was etched into the weary lines around his eyes. Carlos was a good man, but he was tired, a veteran of a foster care system that demanded infinite patience and offered finite support. The house was clean, the meals were regular, and there was no overt cruelty, yet it was not a home. It was a holding station, a space filled with furniture that held no memories and walls that had never heard his laughter. Dylan was grateful for the stability, but it was the gratitude of a survivor, not a son. He kept his small room meticulously neat, his few possessions confined to a single backpack, always subconsciously prepared for the next move that he had learned could come without warning. He was a guest in someone else's life, acutely aware that his presence was a job, a responsibility, and never simply a given. The most concrete thing in Dylan's life was a number, 247. This was the count of days remaining until his 18th birthday, a date that loomed in his mind with the dual force of a promise and a threat. On that day, he would officially age out of the system. The state's obligation would end, and he would be handed a small check a list of resources, and a final handshake. He would be free, but free to do what? Free to be utterly and completely alone, with no family to call, no safety net to catch him, and no foundation upon which to build a future. This countdown was his silent obsession, a metronome ticking away in the back of his mind, measuring the final moments of the only life he had ever known, a life of structured neglect that was about to be replaced by unstructured abandonment. The origins of his predicament were a story he knew only in sterile administrative terms. His mother, Sarah Chen, had lost custody due to a heroin addiction that consumed her life. He had no memories of her, only the vague second-hand knowledge that she had tried and failed. She died of an overdose 2 years after he entered the system, a final tragic footnote in his case file that officially severed his last biological tie to the world. The concept of a father was even more abstract. There was no name, no picture, no mention at all. He was a product of a broken history, a boy whose roots had been pulled up before they ever had a chance to take hold, leaving him to drift through the years without the anchor of ancestry or the comfort of a family story. His only true refuge was Al's auto repair, a greasy, sprawling garage tucked away in an industrial corner of Portland. The moment he stepped inside, the oppressive silence of his foster life was replaced by the chaotic symphony of impact wrenches, grinding metal, and roaring engines. The air, thick with the smell of gasoline, oil, and hot steel, felt more cleansing to him than any fresh breeze. Here, he wasn't Dylan Hayes' foster kid. He was just Dylan, the kid who had a knack for engines. Al, the gruff, oil-stained owner, had given him a part-time job sweeping floors, but had quickly noticed the boy's intense, focused curiosity. He saw a spark of genuine talent and began teaching him, letting him observe, then assist, and finally work on minor repairs himself. This was more than a job. It was the one part of his life where he felt a sense of control. An engine was a logical puzzle. It had rules, systems, and a clear cause and effect. When something was broken, you could diagnose the problem, find the right part, and with skill and patience, make it whole again. His hands, often shoved deep in his pockets at school, became confident and capable at the garage. He learned to feel the subtle vibration of a misfiring cylinder and to identify the source of a leak by its scent and texture. In a world that had always felt random and chaotic, the mechanical certainty of an internal combustion engine was a profound comfort. It was a language he understood, a predictable system that responded to his efforts in a way people never had. The contrast between his two worlds was stark and unforgiving. At Al's he was competent, trusted, and engaged, his mind occupied with diagrams and torque specifications. He could spend hours lost in the intricate dance of pistons and gears, feeling a sense of purpose that was absent everywhere else. But the moment he clocked out and boarded the bus back to Carlos Martinez's house, the competent mechanic would dissolve, replaced once again by the quiet, unobtrusive foster kid. He would retreat into himself, his voice becoming softer, his movements more hesitant. He would eat his dinner in near silence, do his homework, and then disappear into his room, careful to leave no trace, to be no burden, to simply occupy his designated space until the next day began. His fascination with mechanics naturally bled into a love for classic cars, particularly the powerful American muscle cars of the 1960s. He would spend hours online, studying the lines of old Mustangs, Chargers, and Chevelle. His favorite, the one he sketched in the margins of his notebooks, was the 1967 Chevrolet Impala. To him, it was more than just a car. It was a symbol of a different America, a time of perceived certainty and strength. It represented a kind of freedom and permanence that felt entirely alien to his own experience. The car was a tangible piece of history, solid and real, a stark contrast to his own past, which felt like a collection of faded photocopies and missing pages. This internal focus meant he had few external connections. He moved through the hallways of his high school like a ghost, keeping his head down and avoiding the kind of friendships that required sharing personal history. How could he explain his life to kids who worried about curfews and prom dates? Every potential connection was shadowed by the knowledge of its impermanence. He had learned from a young age that every goodbye was a small tear in the fabric of his being, and he had decided, subconsciously, that it was easier not to sew new attachments at all. His isolation was a shield, heavy and cumbersome, but it protected him from the pain of inevitable loss. Life continued in this flat, predictable rhythm, a cycle of grey Portland skies, the drone of teachers' voices, the clatter of tools at the garage and the suffocating quiet of his temporary bedroom. Each day was a replica of the one before, another page torn from the calendar, bringing him one step closer to the cliff edge of his 18th birthday. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, indistinguishable from any other, that the pattern was broken. He arrived home from his shift at the garage, his hands stained with grease that wouldn't wash out, and found a crisp, formal-looking envelope on the kitchen table. It was registered mail, addressed directly to him, Dylan Hayes. His first reaction wasn't curiosity or excitement, but a familiar cold knot of dread in his stomach. In his world, official letters never brought good news. He held the envelope as if it were a fragile, dangerous thing, its crisp edges and official-looking seal a familiar harbinger of disruption. In his 14 years navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the state system, he had learned that formal correspondence was never a harbinger of good fortune. It was the medium through which social workers announced new placements, delivered reports on his progress, or scheduled mandatory evaluations. Each letter was a paper-based reminder of his status as a ward, a piece of property to be managed and moved according to bureaucratic necessity. He traced the embossed return address with a fingertip still grimy from the garage, the name of a law firm in Eugene, meaning nothing to him. He could feel Carlos's curious but respectful gaze from across the small kitchen, yet Dylan remained locked in a silent standoff with the object on the table, a cold dread coiling in his gut, bracing himself for the next upheaval in a life defined by them. With a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he carefully slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The document inside was dense with the kind of legal jargon designed to be impenetrable, a wall of text that seemed to swim before his eyes. He forced himself to focus, his gaze scanning the page, snagging on words and phrases that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. He saw his own name, Dylan Hayes, typed with cold formality. Then 2 more words jumped out, so alien and unexpected that he had to read them 3 times to be sure they were real. Maternal grandfather. The phrase was followed by a name he had never heard, Robert Chen, and a stark, unambiguous word, deceased. A strange, hollow feeling opened up inside his chest. It wasn't grief, for he could not grieve a person who was nothing more than a ghost of a possibility, but it was the profound ache of a connection discovered only at the moment of its final irreversible severance. The letter was a formal notification of inheritance, a legal instrument informing him that he was the sole beneficiary of Robert Chen's estate. The word inheritance felt absurd, a concept from movies and books that had no place in his reality, a world where his most valuable possession was a well-worn set of wrenches. The document instructed him to contact the undersigned, an attorney named Arthur Vance, to discuss the specifics of the bequest and the necessary legal procedures. He let the paper fall to the table, the name Robert Chen echoing in the quiet kitchen. A grandfather. He had a grandfather. For 17 years, he had been a boy without roots, a tree growing in a portable pot, and now a single piece of paper suggested a history he had been told did not exist, a branch of a family tree he believed had been completely severed. The revelation was not a comfort, it was a disorientation, another piece of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. Carlos, sensing the gravity of the moment, came over and gently picked up the letter. He read it slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Unlike Dylan, Carlos saw not just the confusion, but the potential. However faint, he placed a steady hand on Dylan's shoulder, a rare gesture of paternal comfort. He explained in simple terms that this was something real, something that couldn't be ignored. He pointed to the phone number on the page, telling Dylan that the only way to understand what this meant was to make the call. His voice was calm and practical, grounding Dylan in the face of the emotional vertigo. He didn't offer false hope or grand pronouncements, but his quiet encouragement was a lifeline, pulling Dylan back from the edge of simply crumpling the letter and pretending it had never arrived, retreating back into the familiar, painful safety of his own isolation. The act of dialing the number felt monumental. His thumb hovered over the keypad of the house's cordless phone, his breath catching in his throat. This was a call into the void, a connection to a past that was a complete blank. He was terrified of what he might find, but even more terrified of what he might lose by not finding out. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed the numbers, the electronic tone sounding unnaturally loud in the silent house. The phone rang 3 times, each ring tightening the knot in his stomach, before a polite, professional voice answered. He asked for Arthur Vance, his own voice sounding distant and thin. He was put on hold, the silence filled only by a generic, looping piece of classical music that felt completely at odds with the turmoil raging inside him. It was the longest minute of his life. Mr. Vance's voice came on the line, and it was exactly what Dylan might have expected from a lawyer he had never met. Dry, professional, and entirely devoid of sentiment. It was the sound of paperwork and billable hours, a voice that dealt in facts, not feelings. Dylan identified himself, and he could almost hear the rustle of a file being opened on the other end of the line. The lawyer was efficient, confirming Dylan's identity and his relationship to the deceased. He spoke of Robert Bobby Chen with a detached respect, explaining that his client had passed away peacefully from natural causes 3 weeks prior at the age of 73. Each fact was delivered with a crisp finality that left no room for questions, a sterile summary of a life Dylan was only just learning had been lived. The entire exchange felt transactional, as if they were discussing an inventory item rather than a human being. Then Mr. Vance moved on to the subject of the inheritance. He stated that Robert Chen's estate was modest, consisting of a single asset. He paused, and in that brief silence, Dylan's mind raced with impossible scenarios. Was it a small amount of money? A box of old photographs? The lawyer's next words cut through his speculation with the force of a physical blow. The sole possession left to him was a vehicle, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Not just any car, not a practical sedan or a beat-up truck. It was the exact model, the specific year, the one machine he sketched in notebooks and dreamed of rebuilding. The coincidence was so staggering, so statistically impossible, that it felt like a message sent across time, a whisper from a ghost he never knew. Just as a fragile, impossible hope began to bloom in his chest, the lawyer's pragmatic voice moved to extinguish it. This was the threat, delivered not with malice but with the cold, unassailable logic of the system. Mr. Vance explained that the car had been kept in a prepaid storage unit in Eugene since 1998, for 20 years. He painted a verbal picture of decay and neglect, using phrases like, "in all likelihood," and "realistically speaking." He spoke of flat, rotted tires, seized engine parts, rust, and potential vermin infestations. He was methodically, professionally dismantling the dream, framing the Impala not as a treasure, but as a liability. He was managing expectations, but what Dylan heard was the voice of every adult in his life, telling him not to want for things he couldn't have. The threat became explicit and unequivocal. Mr. Vance explained the financial realities of the situation in stark terms. The prepaid lease on the storage unit was about to expire. If Dylan accepted the inheritance, he would immediately become responsible for the monthly rental fees. Furthermore, removing the vehicle would require a professional towing service, an expense that could run into several $100s. Then there would be the disposal fees if, as the lawyer strongly implied, the car was nothing more than a worthless heap of scrap metal. He was laying out a financial trap, a burden that a 17-year-old foster kid with a part-time job at a garage had absolutely no way of shouldering. He was presenting a clear and present danger to Dylan's already precarious existence. To underscore the point, Mr. Vance then presented the out, the sensible path that the system always preferred. He informed Dylan that he was under no obligation to accept the inheritance. He could legally refuse it, sign a piece of paper, and the estate would simply dispose of the asset. The problem would vanish. The lawyer presented this as the wisest course of action, a way to protect himself from unnecessary trouble and expense. This was the system's final, quiet act of erasure. It was offering him a clean break, advising him to let go of the only tangible link to a family he had ever known, because it was impractical. The world was telling him, in the most polite and legally sound way possible, that this piece of his history was junk, and he should treat it as such. Dylan stood there, phone pressed to his ear, the lawyer's words fading into a dull hum. The cold, hard logic of the situation was undeniable. Every rational part of his brain, every survival instinct honed by years of disappointment, screamed at him to take the easy way out, to sign the paper and walk away. But beneath the fear and the pragmatism, a stubborn, unfamiliar feeling was taking root. It was the image of the Impala, not as a rust bucket, but as the symbol of freedom he had always imagined. It was the name Robert Chen, a man who, for some unknown reason, had held on to this specific car for 2 decades. The threat was clear. Accepting this inheritance could ruin him financially and leave him with nothing but a pile of debt and scrap metal, just as he was about to be thrust into the world alone. But the alternative, refusing it, felt like a betrayal of something he didn't even understand yet. It felt like agreeing that he was, and always would be, completely and utterly alone. He hung up the phone, the plastic receiver feeling cold and heavy in his hand as he placed it back in its cradle. The lawyer's voice, a dispassionate instrument of logic, echoed in the sudden silence of the kitchen. Words like liability, disposal fees, and scrap metal circled in his mind, each one a brick in a wall being built around a flicker of impossible hope. The sensible path, the one the system had always paved for him, was clearly marked. Sign a form, release the claim, and let this ghost from a forgotten past dissolve back into nothingness. It was the safe choice, the adult choice. It was a choice that would cost him nothing and leave him with exactly what he had before. A future meticulously planned to accommodate profound and total emptiness. In that moment, the entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to make the one decision he had been trained his entire life to make, to expect nothing and therefore never be disappointed. The rest of the afternoon and evening passed in a disoriented haze. He went through the motions of his life, finishing his homework, eating the dinner Carlos had prepared, washing his plate, but his mind was miles away, trapped in a silent circular argument. The pragmatic voice, the one that had ensured his survival for 14 years, laid out the facts with brutal clarity. He pulled up his banking app on his phone, the screen glowing in the dim light of his room. The number displayed there, the sum of all his earnings from Al's garage, was laughably small. It wouldn't even cover the cost of a tow truck from Eugene to Portland, let alone the storage fees or the parts needed for a restoration that was likely impossible. The lawyer wasn't being cruel, he was being realistic. Accepting the car was a financial trap, a pitfall designed for someone with a safety net, not for a boy who was less than a year away from being completely on his own. Yet, a quieter, more stubborn voice refused to be silenced. It kept whispering the same unbelievable fact, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala. The sheer, unadulterated improbability of it was a current running under the surface of his fear. It couldn't be a coincidence. It felt like a message, a signal flare fired from a past he'd been told was a barren wasteland. Who was this Robert Chen? This grandfather who existed only as a name on a legal document? Why would a man pay for a storage unit for 20 years, diligently keeping up with the fees, just to preserve a worthless pile of rust? There was a story there, a logic that defied financial sense. It was the logic of sentiment, of memory, of connection. And for Dylan, who had never known any of those things, that logic was infinitely more powerful and compelling than any bank statement. That night, sleep was an impossibility. He lay on his back in the unfamiliar bed, the springs creaking with every small movement, and stared at the textured ceiling. The two opposing forces waged war within him. To refuse the car was to accept the official narrative of his life, that he was an accident, a loose end, a boy whose history began and ended with a case file number. It was to agree with the world that he was truly, irrevocably alone. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, a decision crystallized, not from logic, but from a fierce, desperate act of emotional self-preservation. He would go, he would claim it. It didn't matter if it was a rust bucket. It didn't matter if it bankrupted him. The car's monetary value was irrelevant. Its existence was everything. It was the first and only proof he had ever been given that someone, somewhere, had thought he was worth holding on to something for. With the decision made, a fragile sense of purpose settled over him, but it was immediately challenged by the enormous, unmovable wall of logistics. Eugene was 100 miles away, a 2-hour drive down the interstate. He didn't have a car, and even if he did, he didn't have a license to drive it. He could take a bus, but the storage facility was on the outskirts of the city, far from the station. How would he even get there? And what then? Stand in front of a metal door, look at a car he couldn't move, and then take the bus back. The sheer impracticality of his own decision threatened to crush the newfound resolve. The grand, defiant choice he had made in the dark felt small and foolish in the harsh light of day. He was just a kid, a powerless ward of the state, trying to claim a piece of a world he had no access to. He knew with a sinking feeling of dread that there was only one possible solution. He had to ask Carlos. The thought alone made his stomach churn. In all his years in the system, he had cultivated an identity of needing nothing. He was the easy placement, the quiet kid who never caused trouble, who never asked for favors. Asking for help was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. It was a debt, an obligation. Now he had to ask for the biggest favor of his life, a 4-hour round trip, a full day given up, all in service of what any rational adult would see as a complete fool's errand. He spent the entire morning rehearsing the conversation in his mind, trying to find the right words to make his insane request sound reasonable, preparing himself for the gentle, logical refusal he was sure would come. He found Carlos in the living room that evening, sitting in his worn armchair with the evening newspaper. Dylan stood in the doorway for a full minute, his heart pounding against his ribs, the carefully practiced words dissolving on his tongue. He finally forced himself to step into the room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He explained the situation, his voice low and even, carefully editing out the desperate, irrational hope that was fueling him. He presented it as a simple matter of due diligence, of needing to see the asset before signing away his rights to it. He tried to make it sound like a chore, a legal necessity, rather than the most important pilgrimage of his life. He finished speaking and waited, the rustle of the newspaper the only sound in the room, bracing for the inevitable disappointment. Carlos slowly lowered the paper and looked at Dylan. His gaze was steady and thoughtful, and for the first time, Dylan felt like the man was seeing past the label of foster kid and looking at the young man standing before him, a person on the verge of either a breakthrough or a breakdown. He saw the tension in Dylan's shoulders, the desperate plea buried deep beneath the carefully neutral tone. After a long, agonizing silence, Carlos folded the newspaper, placed it on the table beside him, and simply nodded. He said that Saturday was his day off, and that they could drive down in the morning. There was no lecture, no warning about getting his hopes up, no pragmatic questioning of his motives, just a simple, uncomplicated yes. The quiet affirmation was so unexpected, so profoundly kind, that it almost broke through Dylan's carefully constructed emotional defenses. The next 3 days were a unique form of torture, a slow crawl through time. He went to school and to his shift at the garage, his body moving through the required actions on autopilot, while his mind was already in Eugene, standing before Unit 247. He didn't pack a bag because he owned nothing that would be of any use. His preparation was entirely psychological. He meticulously constructed a mental fortress around his heart, preparing for the absolute worst. He pictured a car collapsed on its axles, its interior ruined by mold and rodents, its body eaten through with rust. He told himself over and over that just seeing it, just laying eyes on the tangible proof of his grandfather's intention, would be victory enough. But it was a fragile lie, a thin shield against a hope so fierce it terrified him. The countdown was no longer to his 18th birthday, but to Saturday, the day he would finally learn if this single thread to his past was a lifeline or just another illusion. The pre-dawn chill of Saturday morning seeped through the thin glass of the kitchen window, turning the air in the house cold and still. Dylan was already awake, having never truly slept, and had been sitting in the silent darkness for over an hour. He wore the same jeans and hoodie he'd worn to the garage the day before, a second skin of grease-stained cotton that felt more like armor than clothing. A profound, vibrating anxiety hummed just beneath his skin, a feeling so intense it was almost a physical sound. Every rational instinct he possessed, every lesson learned from a lifetime of managed expectations, was screaming at him that this was a mistake. He was chasing a ghost, a fantasy woven from an impossible coincidence, and the only thing waiting for him at the end of this journey was the cold, hard confirmation that he was, and always had been, completely alone. The weight of this potential failure was immense, threatening to crush the fragile seed of hope before it even had a chance to sprout. He heard the floorboards creak as Carlos moved about his own room, the quiet sounds of a man getting ready for a day he had not asked for. When they finally met in the hallway, no words were exchanged. There was nothing to say that the tense silence couldn't communicate more effectively. Dylan followed him out into the damp morning air, the sky a deep, starless grey that promised a long, overcast day. Carlos's truck was an old Ford Ranger, its paint faded and its body bearing the dings and scratches of a long, hard-working life. The cab smelled of stale coffee and something vaguely metallic, a scent Dylan found strangely comforting. He climbed into the passenger seat, the vinyl cool against his legs, and pulled the door shut with a solid, reassuring thud. Carlos turned the key, and the engine coughed to life, settling into a low, familiar rumble that vibrated through the frame of the truck and up into Dylan's bones, a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet of the dawn. They pulled out onto the empty streets of Portland, the city still asleep under the glow of streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. Soon they were merging onto the freeway, the truck picking up speed as it joined the sparse flow of early morning traffic heading south on Interstate 5. A light, persistent drizzle began to fall, and Carlos switched on the windshield wipers, their rhythmic, hypnotic sweep across the glass becoming the soundtrack to the journey. Thwomp, 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 thwomp. Each pass of the blades seemed to wipe away a layer of the familiar world, revealing a path into a future that was utterly blank. Dylan stared out the window, watching the blurred lights of the city recede behind them, feeling like a ship casting off its moorings and heading into an unknown and possibly treacherous sea. The grey landscape felt like a perfect reflection of his own internal state, a world without colour, defined only by the road ahead and the oppressive weight of the clouds above. An hour into the drive, as the last vestiges of the Portland suburbs gave way to the rolling green hills and farmland of the Willamette Valley, the initial nervous energy began to curdle into a thick, cold dread. The lawyer's voice replayed in his mind, a merciless loop of pragmatic warnings. Worthless junk. Significant disposal fees. You are under no obligation to accept. What was he even doing? He was a 17-year-old kid with a few $100s to his name, chasing after a car that had been rotting in a box for 20 years. He felt a powerful, almost physical urge to tell Carlos to stop, to turn the truck around and go back to the predictable, manageable emptiness of his life. The shame of his own foolishness washed over him, hot and suffocating. He had allowed a single impossible coincidence to override every survival instinct he had ever developed. The silence in the cab suddenly felt immense, and he was sure Carlos could sense his mounting panic. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against them as if he could physically push the fear away. He forced his mind away from the lawyer's words and toward the one place he felt competent and in control, the garage. He pictured an engine, a simple V8, and mentally began to disassemble it. He saw the intake manifold, the cylinder heads, the pistons moving in their perfect synchronized dance. He imagined the feel of a wrench in his hand, the satisfying click of a socket wrench tightening a bolt to the correct torque. An engine was a system of logic. It didn't have feelings or ulterior motives. It was broken or it worked. If it was broken, you could diagnose the problem, and, with the right tools and knowledge, you could fix it. You could make it whole again. He clung to this thought, this mechanical certainty, like a drowning man clinging to a piece of wreckage. It was a small, solid piece of ground in a sea of emotional chaos. Halfway to Eugene, Carlos pulled off the freeway into a sprawling truck stop that buzzed with the low thrum of idling diesel engines. The air was thick with the smell of rain and exhaust fumes. He announced they were stopping for coffee, and Dylan followed him into the brightly lit convenience store, feeling dazed and out of place. The harsh fluorescent lights, seemed to magnify his exhaustion after a sleepless night, and the forced cheerfulness of the place felt alien and jarring. He stood by a rack of snacks, not really seeing anything, while Carlos paid for 2 coffees and a hot chocolate. The older man wordlessly handed the warm cup to Dylan, a simple, unspoken gesture of care that momentarily cut through the fog of his anxiety. He wrapped his cold hands around the cup, the warmth seeping into his fingers, and for a few minutes he allowed himself to just stand there, breathing in the scent of chocolate and feeling the solid ground beneath his feet. Back in the truck, the landscape continued its monotonous scroll. The weak morning light did little to burn through the thick layer of clouds, casting the world in shades of grey. The hot chocolate had settled the worst of his nerves, but a deep sense of vulnerability remained. He was more than 100 miles from anything he knew, travelling toward an object that represented the biggest question mark of his life. Was it a link to a family he never knew, or was it just a pile of metal that would become his first and greatest failure as an adult? He watched the mile markers flash by, each one a countdown to a moment of truth he felt completely unprepared for. The journey felt less like a trip and more like a verdict being delivered, and he was just a passenger, powerless to influence the outcome. He was a piece of driftwood, caught in a current, being pulled inexorably toward an unknown shore. Suddenly, a massive 18-wheeler that had been tailgating them decided to pass. It roared by in a deafening spray of sound and water, a wall of metal and noise that shook the small truck. A sheet of dirty road water slammed against their windshield, completely blinding them for a terrifying second. Carlos didn't flinch, his hands steady on the wheel as he held their course, but Dylan's heart leaped into his throat, hammering against his ribs. The moment passed as quickly as it came, the semi disappearing down the highway, but the jolt of adrenaline left him trembling. It was a stark, violent reminder of how fragile everything was, how easily their journey could be ended by a single moment of bad luck or a stranger's carelessness. The world felt random and dangerous, and his quest suddenly seemed impossibly small and naive in the face of it. Then he saw it. A large green sign rose up from the side of the interstate, the word Eugene printed in stark white letters. The name of the city, which had been an abstract concept for days, was now a concrete reality just a few miles away. A fresh wave of nausea and anxiety rolled through him. There was no turning back now. The hypothetical had become real. He felt a strange disconnect from his own body, as if he were watching a movie about some other kid. He could feel the worn fabric of the seat, the vibration of the engine, but his mind was already at the storage facility, standing before a locked metal door. He instinctively reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the single, cold, unfamiliar key the lawyer had mailed to him. Its sharp edges dug into his palm, a small, painful point of focus in the overwhelming uncertainty. Carlos navigated the unfamiliar city streets with a quiet competence, his phone's GPS directing them through a series of turns. They left the main roads and entered a more industrial part of town, an area of warehouses, chain-link fences, and low, functional buildings. The world became more angular and grey, the landscape stripped of any warmth or personality. This was a place for things, not people. Dylan's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of place where a forgotten car would be left to die, a mechanical graveyard where memories went to rust and decay. Every block they drove, every warehouse they passed, seemed to confirm the lawyer's pragmatic assessment. The fragile hope he had so carefully nurtured was beginning to wither under the harsh reality of the surroundings. Finally, they turned onto a street lined with nothing but self-storage facilities. Carlos slowed the truck, and Dylan saw the sign, Eugene Secure Storage. It was a massive, sprawling complex, a city of metal boxes baking under the pale, watery sun that had finally broken through the clouds. It was impersonal, anonymous, and vast. It was a place built for forgetting. Carlos pulled up to a large, black iron gate and an electronic keypad. He took a slip of paper from his wallet and carefully punched in the access code. With a low, mechanical groan, the gate began to slide open. A slow, deliberate movement that felt like the opening of a tomb. The sound echoed in the quiet air, a final metallic permission to enter this place of abandoned things and see what piece of it now belonged to him. They drove slowly down the long numbered aisles, the truck's tires crunching on the loose gravel. Row after row of identical roll-up metal doors stretched out before them, a seemingly infinite grid of anonymity. Dylan scanned the numbers, his eyes jumping from one unit to the next. 100 series, 200 series, the numbers climbed higher. 241, 243, 245. His breath caught in his throat, and then he saw it. Unit 247. It was indistinguishable from the hundreds of others, a blank face of corrugated steel, stained with faint traces of rust near the bottom. It was nothing and everything all at once. The number that had marked his countdown to abandonment was now a physical place, a destination. The journey was over. Carlos parked the truck, and the silence that descended when he cut the engine was absolute. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Dylan just stared at the door, at the simple, unassuming brass padlock that secured it. This was the final barrier, the last obstacle between his past and his future. Everything he had feared and everything he had hoped for was waiting for him on the other side of that thin sheet of metal. He could feel Carlos's gaze on him, patient and steady. Taking a deep, ragged breath that did little to calm his racing heart, Dylan finally opened the truck door and stepped out onto the gravel. His legs felt weak, as if they might not hold him. He walked the few steps to the unit, the key feeling impossibly heavy in his trembling hand, and stood before the door, ready to face whatever truth it held. The key felt alien in his hand, its sharp, unfamiliar edges digging into his palm as if to remind him of its foreign origin. It was a simple, old-fashioned brass key for a padlock, yet it felt heavier than any tool he had ever held at the garage. He stood before the corrugated steel door of Unit 247, the number a stark, black stencil against the faded grey metal. Carlos stood a few feet behind him, a silent, steady presence that offered support without intrusion. The air in the long, concrete aisle was still and smelled of sun-baked asphalt and dust. Dylan's heart was a frantic, muffled drumbeat in his ears as he finally lifted the key, his trembling hand struggling for a moment to guide it into the small keyhole of the lock. The click of the tumblers turning was unnervingly loud in the profound silence, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to sever a connection to his old life and forge a new one to whatever lay beyond this door. With the padlock removed and hanging loosely from its hasp, he gripped the cold metal handle at the bottom of the roll-up door. He and Carlos took a side each, their hands finding purchase on the worn steel. With a shared, grunting effort, they heaved upwards. The door resisted, groaning in protest as 20 years of disuse were violently disturbed. The sound was a screech of metal on metal, an agonized complaint that echoed down the long row of silent units. It rose slowly, inch by painful inch, revealing a slice of absolute darkness at the bottom. A wave of cool, stagnant air washed over them, a scent so thick with time it was almost a taste. It was the smell of forgotten things, a heavy mixture of dust, aging rubber, and the profound, thirsty silence of a space sealed off from the world for 2 decades. It was the scent of a tomb, and for a terrifying second, Dylan was sure that was exactly what he had just opened. They held the door open, allowing the pale, overcast light of the Oregon sky to penetrate the oppressive gloom within. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was large, occupying the center of the 10 by 20 foot space, a monolithic form shrouded entirely by a heavy grey canvas top. The silhouette, however, was unmistakable. The long, elegant lines, the gentle curve of the roof, the distinct shape of the rear fins. It was the profile of a classic American muscle car. A profound, shuddering wave of relief washed over Dylan, so potent it almost buckled his knees. It was real. It was here. Whatever its condition, it was not an empty space or a pile of discarded junk. It was a car, just as the letter had promised, waiting patiently in the dark for him to arrive. The sight of it was the first solid, tangible piece of evidence that this insane journey was not a complete delusion. Carlos held the door steady, while Dylan took a hesitant step inside, his sneakers crunching softly on the dusty concrete floor. The air inside the unit was even thicker, the particles of dust dancing like tiny ghosts in the single shaft of light from the open door. He approached the shrouded vehicle, his breath held tight in his chest. A strange sense of reverence settled over him, as if he were entering a sacred space. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and laid his palm flat against the rough texture of the canvas tarp. He could feel the solid, unyielding steel of the car's fender beneath the fabric. It was cold and firm, a real physical object that had been waiting here longer than he had been in the foster care system. The simple, tactile sensation of that contact grounded him, cutting through the swirling storm of fear and hope in his mind. This was not a dream. With a silent, shared understanding, he and Carlos each took a corner of the heavy tarp. They pulled it back in a single fluid motion. The canvas slid off the car and fell to the floor with a soft, muffled whoosh, releasing a fresh cloud of ancient dust into the air. And there it was, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala. Its paint, a deep metallic blue, was hidden beneath a thick, uniform layer of pale gray grime, but he could see its true color peeking through in a few places. The chrome trim that lined its powerful body was dulled by time, but it wasn't pitted or eaten away by rust. The tires were flat, sunk down onto the rims, and the whole car sagged on its suspension, but it was whole. It was solid. It was not the rotted-out, worthless shell the lawyer had described and that he had forced himself to expect. It was a ghost, yes, but it was a ghost with good bones, a machine not dead but merely sleeping. For a long moment Dylan could only stare, his mind struggling to process the image before him. He began a slow, deliberate circle around the car, his fingertips trailing lightly across the dusty surfaces. He traced the iconic sweep of the rear fenders, the bold line of the hood, the elegant curve of the C-pillar. This wasn't just any car, it was a physical extension of a person he had never known. Every design choice, every piece of chrome felt like a word in a sentence he was only just beginning to read. This machine had been deliberately preserved. Someone had paid money every single month for 2 decades to keep this specific object safe in this dark, silent room. The sheer, stubborn intentionality of that act was overwhelming. It was a gesture that defied logic and finance, an act of preservation that could only be explained by a motive far more powerful than practicality. He stopped at the driver's side door, his reflection a faint, distorted ghost in the grimy window. He reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily under his hand. The door swung open with a low, complaining squeak from its dry hinges. He slid into the driver's seat, the vinyl cool and cracked beneath him. His hands found the large, thin steering wheel, his fingers wrapping around it as if he had been born to hold it. The interior was a perfect time capsule from the late 1990s. The air smelled of old vinyl and paper. A stack of folded road maps sat in the passenger seat, and a Creedence Clearwater Revival CD was still visible in the dashboard player. It felt less like an abandoned car and more like a place that had been momentarily vacated, as if its owner had just stepped out and would be back at any moment. In that instant, the storage unit ceased to be a cold, impersonal box and became a sanctuary, a private world built for him. It was then, as his gaze swept across the preserved interior, that he saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on the back seat, as if placed there with ceremonial care, was a weathered cardboard box. It wasn't large or ornate, just a simple brown box held shut with yellowed tape. But its presence felt monumental, an object of immense and singular importance in this vehicular tomb. He could see that there was handwriting on the top, faded by time but still legible from where he sat. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He leaned over the front seat, his body contorting in the cramped space, needing to see the words up close. His eyes fixed on the elegant, slightly slanted cursive script and the world outside the car. Outside this very moment, simply dissolved into an irrelevant hum. The message was simple, direct, and aimed at the very core of his being. He read the words once, then twice, then a third time, letting them sink into his soul. For Dylan, when you are ready. It was his name, a name he had only ever seen typed on official documents or spoken by strangers. Here, it was written by hand. An intimate, personal touch from a past he had been told was a complete void. The carefully chosen phrase, "when you are ready," was an acknowledgement, a profound gesture of understanding from a person who had somehow known that the journey to this moment would be long and difficult. He reached back and carefully, reverently lifted the box, its weight feeling both insignificant and immense. He placed it gently on the passenger seat beside him, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control them. He was no longer just a foster kid in a forgotten car. He was the recipient of a message, the inheritor of a story that had been waiting 2 decades for him to arrive. He sat back in the driver's seat, the cracked vinyl pressing into his back, and simply stared at the box. The entire universe seemed to shrink until it was contained within the 4 walls of this storage unit. Within the steel and glass of this dormant machine, every question he had ever had about his life, and many he had been too afraid to even form, seemed to be waiting for an answer inside that simple cardboard container. The sterile administrative narrative of his existence, the one built from case files and social worker reports, felt thin and fragile, about to be shattered by whatever truth this box held. A pressure that had been building in his chest for 17 years finally broke free. A single hot tear escaped his eye, tracing a clean path through the layer of dust on his cheek. It was followed by another, and then another, until a quiet, ragged sob escaped his lips, the first true expression of a grief and a love he never knew he was allowed to feel. His fingers, clumsy with emotion, fumbled with the brittle tape on the cardboard box. He peeled it back, the sound tearing through the profound silence of the storage unit. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings, was a stack of photographs bound by a rubber band and dozens of letters, thick bundles of envelopes organized by year. He lifted the photographs first, his breath catching in his throat. The top image was a slightly faded color print of a young Asian man with a warm, open smile and kind eyes, his black hair neatly combed. He was holding a small baby, wrapped in a blue blanket, who was staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. Dylan's heart seized. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that the baby was him. It was the first picture of himself he had ever seen from before his 3rd birthday, the first visual proof that his life had not begun inside a state-issued file folder. The man holding him, he realized, had to be Robert Chen, his grandfather. He carefully placed the photograph on the dashboard and reached for the first bundle of letters, labeled in the same elegant script, 1998. The top envelope was addressed simply to Dylan. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely open it. The letter inside was written on simple lined paper, the ink slightly faded, but the cursive clear and strong. It began, "My dearest Dylan, if you are reading this, then it means many years have passed and I am gone. It also means you found the Impala, and for that I am more grateful than you can ever know. My name is Robert Chen, but my friends call me Bobby. I am your mother's father, which makes me your grandfather. I know you won't remember me, but I remember you. I held you, I fed you, and I loved you with my whole heart from the moment you were born, and I never ever stopped." The words blurred as fresh tears welled in his eyes, not of grief, but of a staggering, impossible recognition. He read on, his world tilting on its axis with every sentence. The letter explained everything. It told of his daughter, Sarah, Dylan's mother, and her struggle with an addiction that Bobby had tried desperately to help her fight. It spoke of the day she lost custody, a day Bobby described as the worst of his life. He had immediately filed for guardianship, believing it was a simple formality, that of course they would place a child with his only living, loving relative. He wrote of his certainty that he would have Dylan home with him within weeks, how he had prepared the small spare bedroom in his house, filling it with toys and books, waiting for a call that never came. The letter was not bitter or angry. It was filled with a profound, soul-deep sadness, the ache of a man who had been robbed of the one thing that mattered most in his world. He moved to the next bundle, 1999, and the story grew darker, more desperate. Tucked between the letters were official-looking documents, photocopies of legal petitions filed with the court. He saw his own name typed on the forms, a sterile legal heading above paragraphs of dense jargon. With each petition was a letter of denial from a judge. He scanned the reasons, his blood running cold. Inadequate environment, insufficient financial resources, a minor criminal record from the 1970s for petty theft. They had used his grandfather's poverty and a single youthful mistake from 30 years prior as justification to deny him custody. They had deemed a working-class mechanic unfit to raise his own grandson, choosing instead to send a 3-year-old boy into the cold, impersonal machinery of the state. Among the legal papers were copies of letters Bobby had written to a long list of social workers whose names Dylan vaguely recognized from his own files. They were polite, desperate pleas for information, for a single photograph, for an update on his grandson's well-being. He asked if Dylan was happy, if he was healthy, if he was in a good home. Most of the letters were unanswered. A few had short, formal replies stapled to them, citing privacy regulations and stating that no information could be shared. It was tangible proof of a wall of bureaucratic indifference, a system that had not just failed to connect them, but had actively worked to keep them apart. Dylan felt a surge of cold, quiet rage, not just for himself, but for the kind-faced man in the photograph, who had fought so hard and been met with such casual, systemic cruelty. He had not been abandoned. He had been stolen. The letters continued, a chronicle of one-sided love spanning 2 decades. Bobby wrote every few months detailing his life, speaking to Dylan as if he were right there in the room. He wrote about his work at the auto shop where he was a mechanic, about the friends he saw for coffee, about the changing seasons in Eugene. In a letter from 2003, when Dylan would have been 8, Bobby wrote about the Impala. "They took you from me, Dylan," the letter read, "but they can't take you out of my heart. So I saved this car for you. It was the last big project I finished before your mum was born, and she loved riding in it. It's a piece of our family. I'm keeping it safe, paying the rent on this little garage every month just in case. Maybe one day you'll be old enough to find it. Maybe you'll get to drive it and know that your grandpa loved you enough to save you a piece of himself." The sheer weight of that sacrifice settled on Dylan, a physical pressure in his chest. He did the math in his head. 20 years of monthly storage fees. It wasn't a fortune, but for a working man, a mechanic, it was a significant, constant expense. It was a financial commitment made month after month, year after year, with no guarantee of a return, fueled by nothing more than a stubborn, desperate hope. It was a quiet, relentless act of devotion. This car wasn't an inheritance, it was an anchor. It was his grandfather's way of holding on to a piece of their shared history, of keeping a light burning in the darkness, praying that one day Dylan might see its glow and find his way home. The Impala wasn't just a car. It was a 20-year love letter written in steel and chrome and paid for with sacrifice. He spent what felt like hours in that driver's seat, the light outside the open door slowly fading as the afternoon wore on. He read letter after letter, piecing together the life of the man he never knew, and in doing so, piecing together the truth of his own. He learned that Bobby loved fishing on the Mackenzie River, that he thought modern music was mostly noise, and that he had a dog named Gus who died in 2010. He found letters that included detailed advice about the Impala itself. "When you get to the engine," one letter from 2012 advised, "check the carburetor first. That Rochester Quadrajet can be tricky, but it's a good one when it's tuned right. The points and condenser will be shot, so start there." It was a voice from the past, a ghost teaching him, guiding him, passing down a legacy of knowledge and care. He finally reached the last bundle, dated 2018. The handwriting was noticeably shakier, the elegant cursive now a spidery scrawl. The final letter was short, written just 6 months before Bobby's death. "Dylan," it began, "I'm getting tired now. I don't know if I'll be here when you find this. I hope I am, but life doesn't always give us what we hope for. I just want you to know that my life was better, because you were in it, even if I only had you for a little while. Don't let the world make you hard. Don't let them convince you that you're alone. You were loved, son. You were so loved. Now go build yourself a good life. That's all I ever wanted for you." Dylan held the fragile piece of paper, tracing the final wavering signature. The sobs he had been holding back finally broke free, a raw, ragged sound that filled the small, dusty space. It was the sound of 17 years of loneliness, dissolving in a flood of belated love. He sat there for a long time, the letters and photographs spread across the seats around him, a mosaic of a life that should have been his. Carlos had remained outside, a silent guardian, never once intruding on the sacred, painful privacy of the moment. The sterile black-and-white narrative of his existence, the abandoned child, the ward of the state, the unwanted file, had been obliterated, replaced by a story of vibrant, tragic color. He was not a loose end. He was the grandson of Robert Bobby Chen, a good man, a mechanic who loved him enough to fight for him, and when that failed, to wait for him. He picked up the first photograph again, the one of Bobby holding him as a baby. He looked at the man's smiling eyes and whispered into the quiet of the car, his voice thick with tears. "I found it, Grandpa. I'm here." 3 months later, the greasy, chaotic symphony of Al's auto repair had become the soundtrack to Dylan's new life. Every evening after his shift officially ended, and every weekend from sunup to sundown, he was no longer just an employee but a man on a mission. Al, a man whose gruff exterior concealed a deep well of empathy, had been so moved by Dylan's story that he had given him an unheard-of privilege: free rein of the shop after hours. The hulking, dusty form of the Impala now occupied a corner bay, a patient under the bright, humming fluorescent lights. Dylan poured every dollar he earned and every ounce of his energy into its resurrection, fueled by a purpose so clear and powerful it left no room for doubt or fatigue. He wasn't just fixing a car, he was rebuilding his own history, bolt by painstaking bolt. He worked with his grandfather's letters spread out on a nearby workbench, their pages protected by plastic sleeves, smudged with the grease of his new calling. They were his blueprints, his instruction manuals, his connection to the man teaching him from beyond the grave. When he struggled with the complexities of rebuilding the carburetor, he found the letter from 2012 and followed Bobby's advice to the letter. When he rewired the electrical system, he used a diagram his grandfather had sketched on the back of an envelope. He supplemented this ghostly mentorship with online tutorials and thick repair manuals, his innate mechanical talent now sharpened by an intense, singular focus. He learned to feel the language of the machine, to understand its needs, to coax it back from its long, deep slumber. The day the engine finally turned over was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had replaced the fluids, installed a new battery, rebuilt the fuel system, and spent a full week meticulously tuning the ignition. With Al and Carlos standing by, he slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The starter ground for a long, agonizing moment, and then, with a deafening roar, the 327 V8 engine exploded back to life, its deep, rumbling idle filling the cavernous garage. It was a sound that had been silent for 20 years, a mechanical heartbeat resurrected. In that moment, Dylan felt his own life truly begin. The sound was more than just an engine. It was a promise fulfilled, a connection made tangible, a powerful declaration that he and the love his grandfather had for him had survived. On his 18th birthday, the day that had once loomed as a terrifying cliff edge, Dylan did not receive a small check and a list of resources from a social worker. He did not walk out of Carlos Martinez's house into a future of uncertainty and loneliness. Instead, he slid behind the wheel of a gleaming, metallic blue 1967 Chevrolet Impala. He had spent the last month polishing the chrome until it shone and buffing the original paint until it glowed with a deep, rich luster. The car wasn't perfect. It bore the small scars and imperfections of a life lived, but it was beautiful, and it was his. He drove away from his last foster home not into a void, but toward a future he was building himself, the rumble of the V8 engine a steady, reassuring presence beside him. Today, at 19, Dylan Hayes rents a small clean room in a house in Eugene, just a few miles from the storage unit where his life was reborn. He works full-time as a junior mechanic at a shop that specializes in classic car restoration, a job Al helped him secure. His hands are perpetually stained with grease, and he spends his days surrounded by the machines his grandfather loved. At night, he takes classes in automotive technology at the local community college, determined to master the craft that is his birthright. He didn't inherit a fortune or discover a new magical family waiting to embrace him. His inheritance was something far more profound and enduring. He received a tangible connection to his past, a story that gave his life meaning, and a clear, unwavering direction for his future. The Impala is his daily driver, a rolling monument to a love that transcended bureaucracy and time. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he drives out to the cemetery where Robert Chen is buried. He doesn't say much. He just parks the car, lets the engine idle, and sits there, a young man at peace, knowing with absolute certainty that he was never a mistake, never a burden, and never, ever forgotten. He was simply a grandson who took the long way home.